You think New Orleans cooking was just what tourists see on menus today? Think again. These meals weren't restaurant specials. They were home dishes from city and country kitchens shaped by French, Spanish, African, and Caribbean hands over hundreds of years. Suppers that once felt ordinary, and now mostly live in old cookbooks and people's memories. Before we're done, we'll visit 25 lost Creole suppers from New Orleans that time forgot, and families still miss. 1. Red Creole jambalaya. Creole jambalaya is one of the true heartbeats of New Orleans cooking, and it didn't start out as a restaurant showpiece. It grew from Spanish paella ideas, with rice and meat cooked together, and then soaked up French technique, African spice, and local sausage and seafood until it became its own thing. The red Creole version uses tomatoes along with onion, bell pepper, celery, and herbs, so the rice takes on that brick red color folks remember from crowded kitchen tables in town. Sausage and chicken were the backbone, and shrimp or other seafood got added when money and market prices allowed. In the middle of the 1900s, this kind of jambalaya was a practical way to feed several people from one pot. But today, many families only meet it as a special recipe instead of something you see regularly on a weeknight stove. 2. Little Money jambalaya. Right beside the big company pots, there were humbler jambalayas meant to stretch groceries, not impress anybody. In these, rice did the heavy lifting, and the meat was whatever was left. Small bits of sausage, chopped chicken, maybe a little leftover roast, all cooked down with the usual onion, bell pepper, and celery. Some home cooks cut back on tomatoes or used just a spoonful of paste, especially when canned goods cost more than they wanted to spend. But they still seasoned with cayenne, thyme, and bay leaves, so the rice stayed bold and savory. Food historians and local writers talk about this kind of one-pot cooking as a survival tactic in both Creole and country Louisiana homes, a way to turn scraps into something filling and respectable. As boxed rice mixes and prepared meals took over, that off-the-cuff, use what you have, jambalaya, slowly slipped out of regular rotation, even though the pattern of stretching rice around a little meat had fed families for generations. 3. Shrimp Creole. Over rice. Shrimp Creole is another New Orleans classic that once showed up in home kitchens far more than it does now. It's an early Creole dish built on a tomato base, made from shrimp simmered with onion, bell pepper, celery, garlic, and cayenne in a rich red sauce. Unlike gumbo, it doesn't depend on a dark roux. Instead, the body and color come from those tomatoes and long simmering, and it's always meant to be spooned over plain white rice. The flavors trace back to French and Spanish cooking, with African and Caribbean spice layered in over time, and it grew into one of the signature city seafood plates around New Orleans. For decades, shrimp Creole was a recognizable home supper when Gulf shrimp were in good supply. But as people leaned more on quick skillet dishes and pre-made sauces, a lot of younger cooks stopped learning this exact tomato and shrimp combination, even while restaurants kept serving their own versions. 4. Red beans and rice on Mondays. Red beans and rice may be the most famous home supper New Orleans ever produced, and it's deeply tied to the rhythm of the week. Traditionally, many households cooked a larger ham or pork roast on Sunday, then used the bone and scraps to flavor a pot of red beans on Monday, the day laundry and heavy housework were done. Those beans simmered slowly with onion, bell pepper, celery, and bay leaves, often with smoked sausage or salted pork added when it was available. The long simmer and the starchy beans created a creamy texture that people still look for in a proper pot, and the whole dish was meant to be served over plain white rice. This Monday pattern became so strong that food writers now call red beans and rice a weekly tradition in Louisiana. Yet in many homes, the slow, all-day simmer has been replaced with quicker meals, leaving the true old-style beans more as a cultural touchstone than a regular family supper. Did your house have a red beans night or some other set supper you could count on every week? I'd love to know what day and what dish it was. 5. Meat-stretching red bean suppers. While some pots of red beans were full of sausage, many everyday versions were designed to stretch a very small amount of meat over a large pot. In these, the emphasis was on beans and rice, with just enough smoked sausage, ham, or pickled pork to season the liquid and provide a few bites of meat per plate. Local brands of beans and sausage became part of household habit in South Louisiana, chosen for how they held their shape, or flavored the broth during long cooking. Cookbooks and local histories describe this pattern as a practical response to tight budgets. Beans provided protein and calories, rice extended the meal, and meat acted more as a flavoring than a centerpiece. As meat became more affordable and convenience foods more common, this precise balance of bean first, meat second, faded, and many people now think of red beans mainly in restaurant portions, rather than as an economical staple on their own stove. 6. Chicken and sausage gumbo. Chicken and sausage gumbo stands at the center of many Louisiana food histories because it brings together influences from West Africa, France, Spain, and Native American cooking in one pot. Creole gumbos often begin with a dark roux. Flour cooked slowly in fat until it reaches a deep brown color. Then add the holy trinity of onion, celery, and bell pepper, along with stock, pieces of chicken, and smoked sausage. Okra or filet powder, made from ground sassafras leaves, may be used to thicken and flavor the dish, reflecting African and indigenous contributions to the recipe. Served over rice, this gumbo became a hallmark of home and holiday cooking in New Orleans and surrounding areas throughout the 20th century. In many modern households, however, the time and attention required to make a proper roux and simmer the gumbo for hours has pushed it away from being a frequent supper and toward an occasional event-style meal. 7. Every day, use what you have, gumbo. Beyond formal recipes, many families prepared simpler gumbos that were driven by what they had on hand, rather than by a fixed list of ingredients. These pots might use a lighter roux, or even skip roux entirely in favor of okra, and rely on small amounts of inexpensive sausage, leftover poultry, or other meats to flavor the broth. The vegetable base still leaned on onion, pepper, and celery, and cooks adjusted thickness and spice with local peppers, filet, and whatever greens or vegetables needed to be used. Food historians note that this more improvisational gumbo blurred the lines between Creole, city cooking, and rural Cajun styles, especially when tomatoes were omitted and smoke-cured meats took the lead. As more people turned toward standardized printed recipes and store-bought soups, that habit of building a gumbo out of scraps and garden odds and ends became less common, taking a whole category of flexible, everyday gumbos with it. 8. Oyster loaves and fried oyster suppers. New Orleans once had a strong tradition of oyster loaves, large crusty loaves of bread hollowed or split and filled with fried oysters, served as a meal rather than a small snack. These could be seen as early cousins to the oyster po' boy, and they show up in accounts of middle-class and working-class New Orleanians enjoying fried seafood between thick slices of local bread. Oysters themselves have long been central to the city's food identity, harvested from nearby waters and featured in both fancy restaurant dishes and more modest home suppers. In a home context, a generous oyster loaf or a plate of fried oysters with bread could easily take the place of a more formal, plated dinner. As taste shifted and frying at home declined, these oyster-heavy suppers have become rarer in domestic kitchens, even while oyster po' boys and oyster appetizers continue to appear on restaurant menus. 9. Creole daube with spaghetti. Creole daube is a slow-braised beef dish that reflects both French and Italian influences within New Orleans' Creole community. A relatively tough cut of beef is marinated or browned, then simmered in a tomato-rich gravy with aromatics such as onions, garlic, herbs, and sometimes olives or wine, until it becomes tender enough to slice easily. In many New Orleans homes, especially those with Italian heritage, the daube gravy was traditionally served over spaghetti, blending old-world pasta habits with local Creole sauce. Historic menus and oral histories from the city mention this daube and spaghetti combination as a common Sunday or special occasion meal well into the mid-20th century. Today, while pot roast and pasta remain familiar, this specific Creole daube preparation has largely retreated into older cookbooks and family stories, rather than appearing regularly on contemporary weeknight tables. 10. Stuffed merlton with shrimp. Merlton, also known as chayote, is a pear-shaped squash that became closely associated with Louisiana and especially New Orleans cooking. Stuffed merlton typically involves boiling the squash until tender, scooping out the flesh and mixing it with shrimp, breadcrumbs, onions, and seasonings, before packing it back into the shells or a baking dish and browning it in the oven. Local culinary histories point to stuffed merlton as a classic holiday and family gathering dish, particularly around Thanksgiving and Christmas, when seafood-based casseroles were popular on Creole tables. The recipe showcases how city cooks combined garden produce with Gulf shrimp and French-style baking techniques. As frozen casseroles and non-local vegetables became more common, merlton lost some visibility outside of Louisiana, and even within the region, many families now encounter stuffed merlton more as a heritage recipe than as a regular seasonal supper. 11. Shrimp stuffed eggplant. Shrimp stuffed eggplant offers another example of Creole cooks using seafood and vegetables to build a complete baked supper. In this dish, eggplant halves are partially cooked. Their pulp is scooped out and chopped, then combined with shrimp, sautéed vegetables, breadcrumbs, and sometimes cheese or cream to form a savory stuffing. The mixture is placed back into the shells or into a casserole and baked until set, often with a light crust on top. New Orleans food historians and community memories describe shrimp stuffed eggplant as a popular option for family meals and church gatherings in the mid-20th century, taking advantage of both local produce and ready access to shrimp. As tastes have shifted towards simpler, quicker seafood preparations and less time-intensive casseroles, this particular style of shrimp and eggplant bake has become less frequent on home menus, even while similar flavors appear in restaurant dishes. 12. Fish à la Creole. Fish à la Creole refers to fish cooked in or topped with a tomato-based sauce seasoned with the vegetable trinity, garlic, and herbs, often including hot pepper for a gentle heat. Historic recipes call for species like red snapper or trout, which were baked or simmered with this Creole sauce and then served over rice or with bread to capture the juices. The dish reflects the broader pattern of French techniques, like saucing and baking, being adapted to Louisiana ingredients and spice preferences. In the mid-20th century, such preparations were part of normal home cooking in coastal and urban areas, but many modern households instead rely on simpler grilled fish or pre-seasoned frozen fillets. As a result, the specific name fish à la Creole and its characteristic tomato and trinity sauce have become less familiar outside older cookbooks and restaurant menus that maintain traditional terminology. 13. Creole fish stews and bouillabaisse-style pots. New Orleans cooks once made fish stews that clearly echoed French bouillabaisse, but used local seafood and herbs. Older recipes describe simmering fish heads and bones with onions and seasonings to make a stock, then gently poaching slices of fish in that broth and serving it with bread or over rice. These stews drew on French methods, but folded in Gulf species and local spices, turning what might have been a restaurant dish elsewhere into a home supper in port cities like New Orleans. As commercial fish fillets, frozen seafood, and simplified pan frying took over kitchens in the later 20th century, that long-simmered stock-based fish stew became less common outside of dedicated traditional cooks and specialty restaurants. 14. Rice and gravy with smothered meats. Rice and gravy appears in lists of classic Creole dishes, often linked with smothered meats such as pork chops, beef, or chicken, browned in a pan with onions. The technique relies on slowly cooking the onions and meat drippings, deglazing the pan with stock or water, and creating a rich brown gravy to pour over plain rice. This style of cooking connects French pan sauces with Louisiana's love of rice, turning relatively modest cuts of meat into filling suppers that stretched across multiple plates. Over time, as families moved away from cooking large batches of rice and everyday pan gravies, many of these simple rice and gravy meals slipped behind more modern pre-sauced meats and convenience dishes in the weekly rotation. 15. Smothered okra and tomatoes over rice. Smothered okra and tomatoes, cooked down with onion and often flavored with bits of smoked meat or seasoning, is another deeply rooted Louisiana dish that could easily become a full supper. Okra arrived in the region through African influence and became crucial in both gumbo and vegetable dishes, while tomatoes and peppers reflected New World and European contributions. When okra, tomatoes, and aromatics are simmered until thick and spooned over rice, they form a meat-light but satisfying meal that shows how Creole cooks relied on vegetables as more than side dishes. As canned soups and frozen vegetable mixes gained ground, this particular combination, long-cooked fresh okra and tomatoes served as the centerpiece, became much less visible in everyday New Orleans home cooking. 16. Maque Choux, corn suppers. Maque Choux is a traditional Louisiana corn dish whose name likely reflects a blend of Native American and French influences. It typically combines fresh corn kernels with onions, bell pepper, and sometimes tomatoes, cooked down in fat until the corn turns sweet and slightly creamy. In some versions, Cooks add cream, stock, or a little smoked meat. But there is also a long history of Maque Choux being served as a mostly vegetable dish, especially in summer when corn is abundant. Food historians and regional writers describe Maque Choux as a side, but in many households, a generous pan of it with bread or rice functioned as a light supper. As fewer people husk fresh corn at home and rely more on packaged sides, old-style Maque Choux has shifted from common table fare to a specialty recipe pulled out when someone wants to cook Cajun or Creole for a specific occasion. If you had a big backyard garden growing up, what was the one vegetable your family could never eat fast enough? 17. New Orleans-style baked chicken Creole. Baked chicken in a Creole style usually means pieces of chicken cooked with tomatoes, onion, bell pepper, celery, and herbs, forming a sauce right in the baking pan. Some recipes label this chicken Creole, echoing shrimp Creole by replacing the seafood with chicken, but keeping the tomato and Trinity base. The dish offered a practical way to combine French-style sauce chicken with New Orleans' preferred aromatics and serve it over rice, pasta, or bread for a complete supper. As prepared sauces, takeout chicken, and rotisserie birds became more readily available, many families stopped making this specific baked Creole chicken at home, even if they continued eating similar flavors in restaurant or prepackaged form. 18. Red bean jambalaya. Red bean jambalaya is a later evolution that marries two Louisiana staples, jambalaya and red beans, into one hearty pot. In this style, cooks brown sausage with onion, celery, and bell pepper, add rice, tomatoes, and stock, and fold in cooked red beans so the flavors of smoky meat, beans, and seasoned rice come together. The dish reflects the ongoing creativity of home cooks who wanted the flavor of Monday beans and the convenience of a single rice casserole. Although this concept fits neatly into modern one-pan cooking trends, it remains less famous than its parent dishes, and many people outside the region have never heard of red bean jambalaya as a named, distinct supper. 19. Creole cream cheese suppers. Creole cream cheese is a soft, fresh cheese with a tangy flavor that was once widely produced by dairies around New Orleans. Traditionally, it was eaten at breakfast or as a light dessert, often with sugar, fruit, or poured cream, and sometimes spread on French bread or crackers. In warm weather, a bowl of Creole cream cheese with fruit, preserves, or a slice of sweet bread could easily serve as a simple evening meal in households that favored lighter suppers. As commercial production declined and regulations changed, Creole cream cheese nearly disappeared from markets in the late 20th century, surviving mainly through small producers and revival efforts. That shift naturally reduced its presence as an everyday supper option. If this is bringing back memories of a dish your mama or grandma made, tap like and maybe save this one, so you don't lose that recipe idea later. 20. Beignets with café au lait. Beignets are deep-fried squares of yeast dough, heavily dusted with powdered sugar, that trace back to French influence and became an emblematic New Orleans treat. They are traditionally served with café au lait, coffee often blended with chicory and hot milk, and have been associated with local coffee stands and cafes since at least the 19th century. For many city residents, a generous plate of beignets and coffee could stand in for a full meal, especially as a late evening or brunch-style supper. Today, beignets remain famous, but are frequently treated as a tourist or special outing food rather than a casual at-home supper, like they once could be in New Orleans households. 21. Syrup cakes and gâteau de sirop. Cane syrup became a core sweetener in Louisiana, and gâteau de sirop, a dark, moist cake made with syrup, emerged as a traditional dessert. Historical notes on Creole cooking mention syrup being used in pecan pies, gingerbread, spice cookies, and simple cakes, often poured over biscuits or served with pancakes in place of more expensive refined sugar. A thick slice of syrup cake with milk or coffee could function as a light meal, especially in lean times when dessert and supper merged. As refined sugar, commercial pastries, and boxed cake mixes became standard, these syrup-based cakes and their role as occasional standalone suppers became less common, remaining mainly in older family recipe collections and regional cookbooks. 22. Pralines as supper sweets. Pralines, candies made from sugar, butter, and pecans, are closely linked to New Orleans and have documented ties to French praline traditions adapted with Louisiana cane sugar and native pecans. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Black women known as pralinières or praline vendors sold them on New Orleans streets, making pralines a familiar everyday sweet. In home kitchens, leftover pralines or small batches made for holidays often ended up as part of a light evening plate alongside bread, coffee, or fruit. As candy production became industrialized and store-bought sweets replaced home sugar work, pralines shifted from a regular homemade confection to a specialty item tourists and locals buy from dedicated shops. 23rd King Cake Suppers in Carnival season. King cake is a ring or braid-shaped cake associated with Epiphany and Carnival season in New Orleans, typically decorated in purple, green, and gold sugar. The tradition includes hiding a small baby figurine, bean, or trinket inside. Whoever receives the slice containing it is expected to provide the next cake or host the next gathering. During busy carnival weeks, many families treated slices of king cake, coffee, and simple cold foods as sufficient supper on parade nights. While king cake remains a strong seasonal presence in New Orleans bakeries and supermarkets, the homemade versions that once anchored small home gatherings are less common, replaced by purchased cakes and quicker meals around them. 24th. Leftover plate. Suppers. Another quiet category of Creole suppers involved assembling plates from leftovers. A scoop of cold red beans, a piece of French bread, perhaps a bit of seafood, or a sweet like praline. This pattern reflects a thrift-minded approach where nothing from the pot of beans, tray of seafood, or pan of dessert was wasted, and people made informal meals from what remained. New Orleans food culture has long emphasized both abundance and economy, and leftover plates show the everyday side of that, contrasting with the elaborate restaurant image of Creole cuisine. As refrigeration, takeout, and individually packaged foods reshaped how people handle leftovers, this style of assemble a plate from yesterday's dishes has gradually faded as a named, recognizable supper pattern. 25. Fading home suppers and surviving restaurant classics. Many of these Creole suppers, jambalaya, shrimp Creole, red beans and rice, gumbo, stuffed merlton, Maque Choux, Beignets, king cake, remain visible in New Orleans tourism and restaurant culture. What has changed is their frequency and form in ordinary home kitchens, especially outside older generations who learned them by watching rather than from written recipes. As prepared foods, time pressures, and changing tastes reshaped daily cooking, the full home-style versions of these dishes became less common at the family table, even though they still represent the historical core of Creole city cooking. When you look over this list, it's really a list of people as much as it is a list of suppers. These pots and pans and syrup cakes didn't just appear on their own. Somebody stood there, tasting and adjusting until it felt right, long before there was a printed recipe to follow. A lot of those somebodies aren't with us anymore, and that's why these meals feel so tender to talk about. The dishes fade when the hands that made them are gone, and whole families end up missing a flavor they can't quite name. If any one of these Creole suppers made you think, "Oh, I remember that," or "I wish I'd written that down for Mama," you're not alone. You're in a whole quiet crowd of folks trying to remember how their house used to smell at supper time. So maybe the next step isn't to bring all 25 back. Maybe it's just to pick one. One pot of red beans, one pan of jambalaya, one simple syrup cake, and let it live again in your kitchen. And if you'd like to keep walking through these old kitchens with me, the next stop is that Mississippi Delta video, where the city flavors give way to country suppers that disappeared the same way. Not all at once, but one quiet evening at a time.